1961, the cost to launch a kilogram of something into low Earth orbit, and a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds, and this figure is adjusted for inflation, was about $118,500 per kilogram, using the Scout, or Solid Controlled Orbital Utility Test System of rockets, which were developed by the US government in collaboration with LTV Aerospace. This price tag dropped substantially just a handful of years later, in 1967, with the launch of the Saturn V, which was a staggeringly large launch vehicle for the time, but also to this day, with a carrying capacity of more than 300,000 pounds, which is more than 136,000 kilograms, and a height of 363 feet, or 111 meters, which is about as tall as a 36-story building and is 60 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty. Because of that size, the Saturn V was able to get stuff and people into orbit and beyond. This was the vehicle that got humans to the moon, after all, at a dramatically reduced cost compared to other options at the time, typically weighing in at something like $5,400 per kilogram. And again, that is compared to $118,500 per kilogram just 6 years earlier with the Scout platform. So one of the key approaches to reducing the cost of lifting stuff out of Earth's gravity well, so it could be shuffled around in space, and in some rare cases beyond Earth orbit, but usually to somewhere within that orbit, as is the case with satellites and space stations, has been to just lift more stuff all at once. And in this context, using the currently available and time-tested methods for chucking things into space at least, that means using larger rockets, or big rocket arrays composed of many smaller rockets, which then boost a huge vehicle out of Earth's gravity well, usually by utilizing several stages, which can burn up some volume of fuel before breaking off the spacecraft, which then reduces the amount of weight that it's carrying and clears the way, allowing for secondary and in some cases tertiary rocket boosters to then kick in and burn their own fuel, carrying it the rest of the distance into space. The Soviet Union briefly managed to usurp the Saturn V's record for being the cheapest rocket platform in the mid-1980s with its Zenit II medium-sized rocket, but the Zenit II was notoriously fault-ridden, and it suffered a large number of errors and explosions, which made it less than ideal for most use cases. The Long March 3B, built by the Chinese in the mid-1990s, got close to the Saturn V's cost efficiency record, managing about $6,200 per kilogram, but it wasn't until 2010 that a true usurper to that cost efficiency crown arrived on the scene in the shape of the Falcon 9, built by US-based private space company SpaceX. The Falcon 9 was also notable in part because it was partially reusable from the beginning. It had a somewhat rocky start, and if the US government had not been there to keep giving SpaceX contracts as it worked through its early glitches, the Falcon 9 may not have survived to become the industry-changing product that it eventually became. But once it got its legs under it and stopped blowing up all the time, the Falcon 9 showed itself capable of carrying payloads of around 15,000 pounds, which is just over 7,000 kilograms, into orbit using a two-stage setup. And remarkably, and this also took a little while to master, but SpaceX did eventually make it common enough to be an everyday thing, the Falcon 9's booster, which decouples from the rocket after the first stage of the launch, can land itself vertically and intact and ready for refurbishment and reuse. That means these components, which are incredibly expensive, could be reused potentially over and over again, rather than just discarded, as had been the case with every other rocket and every other rocket component throughout history. And again, while it took SpaceX some time to figure out how to make that work, they have reached a point today where at least one booster that they use has been used 22 times, which represents an astonishing savings for the company, which it is then able to pass on to its customers, which in turn allows it to outcompete pretty much everyone else operating in the private space industry as of the second half of 2024. The cost to lift stuff into orbit using a Falcon 9 is consequently something like $2,700 per kilogram, about half of what the Saturn V could claim for the same. SpaceX is not the only company using reusable spacecraft, though. Probably the most well-known reusable spacecraft was NASA's Space Shuttle, which was built by Rockwell International and flown from the early 1980s until 2011, when the last shuttle was retired. These craft were just orbiters, not really capable of sending anyone or anything beyond low Earth orbit, and many space industry experts and researchers consider them to be a failure, the consequence of bureaucratic expediency and NASA budget cuts, and maybe a wholesale lack of ambition in the US Space Agency, rather than solid engineering or made-for-purpose utility. But they did come to symbolize the post-space race era in many ways, as while the Soviet and then the successor Russian space program continued to launch rockets in a more conventional fashion. We didn't really see much innovation across this industry until SpaceX came along and started making their reusable components, dramatically cutting costs and demonstrating that rockets capable of carrying a lot of stuff and people could be made and flown at a relatively low cost, and we thus might be standing at the precipice of a new space race sparked by private companies and cash-strapped government agencies that can, despite that relative lack of resources compared to the first space race at least, can still get quite a bit done because of those plummeting expenses. What I'd like to talk about today is a reusable spacecraft being made by another well-known aerospace company, but one that has had a really bad decade or so, and which is now suffering the consequences of what seems to have been a generation of bad decisions. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. Boeing is a storied, sprawling corporation that builds everything from passenger jets to missiles to satellites. It's one of the US government's primary defense contractors, and it makes about half of all the commercial airliners on the planet. Boeing has also, in recent years, been at the center of a series of scandals, most of them tied to products that don't work as anticipated, and in some cases which have failed to work in truly alarming, dangerous, and even deadly ways. I did a bonus episode on Boeing back in January of this year, so I won't go too deep into the company's history or the wave of recent problems that it's experienced, but the short version is that although Boeing has worked cheek to jowl with the US and its allies' militaries since around World War II, and was already dominating aspects of the burgeoning airline industry several decades before that, it merged with a defense contractor called McDonnell Douglas in the late 1990s, and in the early 2000s it began to reorganize its corporate setup in such a way that financial incentives began to influence its decision-making more than engineering necessities. In other words, the folks in charge of Boeing made a lot of money for themselves and for many of their shareholders, but those same decisions led to a lot of inefficiencies and a drop in effectiveness and reliability throughout their project portfolio, optimizing for the size of their bank account and market cap rather than the quality of their products, basically. Consequently, their renowned jetliners, weapons offerings, and space products began to experience small and irregular, but then eventually more sizable and damaging flaws and disruptions, probably the most public of which was the collection of issues built into their 737 MAX line of jets, two of which crashed in 2018 and 2019, killing 346 people and resulting in the grounding of 387 of their aircraft. A slew of defects were identified across the MAX line by 2020, and an investigation by the US House found that employee concerns reported to upper management went ignored or unaddressed, reinforcing the sense that the corporate higher-ups were disconnected from the engineering component of the company, and that they were fixated almost entirely on profits and their own compensation, rather than the quality of what they were making. All of which helps explain what's happening with one of Boeing's key new offerings, a partially reusable spacecraft platform called the Starliner. The Starliner went into early development in 2010 when NASA asked companies like Boeing to submit proposals for a commercial crew program that would allow the agency to offload some of its human spaceflight responsibilities to private companies in the coming decades. One of the contract winners was SpaceX's Crew Dragon platform, but Boeing also won a contract with its Starliner offering in 2014, which it planned to start testing in 2017, though that plan was delayed, the first unmanned orbital flight test arriving nearly 3 years later at the tail end of 2019, and even then, the craft experienced all sorts of technical issues along the way, including weak parachute systems, flammable tape, and valves that kept getting stuck. It was 2 more years before the company launched the second test flight, and there were more delays leading up to the Starliner's first crew flight test, during which it would carry actual humans for the first time. That human-carrying flight launched on June 5th of 2024, and it carried 2 astronauts to the International Space Station, though it experienced thruster malfunctions on the way up as it approached the ISS, and after several months of investigation, the Starliner capsule still attached to the station all that time, it was determined that it was too risky for those 2 astronauts to return to Earth in the Starliner. That brings us to where we are now, a situation in which there are 2 astronauts aboard the ISS in low Earth orbit who were meant to stay for just over a week, but who will now remain there, stranded in space, for a total of around 8 months, as NASA decided that it was not worth the risk putting them on the Starliner again until they could figure out what went wrong. So they'll be bringing Starliner back to Earth remotely, unmanned, and the stranded astronauts will return to Earth on a SpaceX Crew Dragon craft that is scheduled to arrive in September of this year, and which will return to Earth 6 months in the future. That craft was originally intended to have 4 astronauts aboard when it docks with the ISS, but 2 of those astronauts will be bumped, so there will be room for the 2 who are stranded when it returns in 2025. All of which is incredibly embarrassing for Boeing, which again has already had a truly horrible double handful of years reputationally, and which now has stranded astronauts in space because of flaws in its multi-billion-dollar spacecraft, and those astronauts will now need to be rescued by a proven and reliable craft built by its main in-space competitor, SpaceX. One of the key criticisms of NASA and the way it's operated over the past several decades, from the shuttle era onward, is that it's really great at creating jobs and honorable-sounding positions for bureaucrats and for getting government money into parts of the country that otherwise would not have such money, because that spending can be funneled to manufacturing hubs that otherwise don't have much to manufacture. But it's not as great at doing space stuff, and it hasn't been for a while. That's the general sense amongst many in this industry and connected industries at least. This general state of affairs, allegedly at least, allowed SpaceX to become a huge player in the global launch industry. The dominant player, arguably, by many metrics, because it invested a bunch of money to make reusable spacecraft components and has used that advantage to claim a bunch of customers from less reliable and more expensive competitors. And then it used that money to fund increasingly efficient and effective products and to fund side projects like the satellite-based internet platform Starlink. This has been enabled in part by government contracts. But while Boeing and its fellow defense contractors, which have long been tight-knit with the US and other governments, have used the money that it earns to keep their stock prices high and to invest in lobbyists and similar relationship-reinforcing assets, SpaceX and a few similar companies have been stepping in, doing pretty much everything better, and have thus gobbled up not just the client base of these older entities, but also significantly degraded their reputations by showing how things could be done if these larger companies were to invest differently and focus on engineering quality over financial machinations. Boeing arguably should have been the one to develop the Falcon 9 system or something like it, but instead an outsider had to step in and make that happen because of how the incentives in the space launch world have worked. One of the big concerns now is that Boeing will retreat from its contract with NASA, leaving the agency with fewer options in terms of ISS resupply and astronaut trips. but also in terms of longer-term plans like returning to the moon and exploring the rest of the solar system. Lacking industry competition, NASA could become more and more reliant on just a few players, and that's arguably what led to the current situation with Boeing. Boeing's higher-ups knew they would get billions from the government on a regular basis, pretty much whatever they did, no matter how flawed their products and delayed their timelines, and that led to a slow accretion of bad habits and perverse incentives. There's a chance the same could happen to SpaceX and similar entities over time if they are able to kill off enough of their competition so that they become the de facto go-to option, rather than the best among many choices, which they arguably are for many such purposes at the moment. And because Boeing seems unlikely to be able to fulfill its contract with NASA, which would necessitate flying 6 more Starliner missions to the ISS before the International Space Station is retired in 2030, this raises the question of whether the company will move forward with the reportedly expensive investments that would be necessary to get its Starliner program up to snuff and usable. It's already on the hook for about $1.6 billion just to pay for various delays and cost overruns this project has accrued up till this point. And that does not include all the other investments that might be necessary to help it fulfill that contract. So they could look at the short-term money side of this and say, basically, we are walking away. We are ceding this aspect of the aerospace world to younger, hungrier companies, and we'll just keep on collecting the reliable dollars we know we will get from the US military each year. No questions asked. We could then see Boeing leave the race for what looks to be the next space-related government contract bonanza, which will probably be related to NASA's smaller, more modular space station ambitions. The ISS may get a second wind and be maintained past 2030, but either way, NASA is keen to hire private companies to launch larger craft into low Earth orbit for long-term habitation. Supplies and crew for these mini space stations shuttled back and forth by companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, the latter of which is a direct competitor to SpaceX and owned by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. Boeing has been tapped by Blue Origin to keep their in-orbit assets supplied under that new paradigm, but it could be that they show themselves incapable of safely and reliably doing so, or they decide to step away from this space entirely, and that could open up more opportunities for other, smaller entities in this space if they can figure out how to compete with the increasingly dominant SpaceX. But it could also, again, result in a new monopoly controlled by just one or a few companies, which then over time will themselves have to fight the urge to succumb to the same perverse incentives that seem to be weighing on Boeing. The book I'd like to recommend today is called What's Our Problem by Tim Urban. You might already be aware of Tim Urban's work. He's the creator of Wait But Why, which is a really fun and interesting and enlightening blog that is illustrated with funny little stick figures and other such hand-drawn illustrations. And he covers a lot of complex and heady and mind-expanding topics on that blog. And this book is similar in that it looks at a lot of the ills otherwise healthy societies might face, and how some of those ills might be addressed, or bare minimum, the way that we might think about them in productive ways, as opposed to either succumbing to them or just complaining about them. And among the many topics that are covered in this book, he looks at things like tribalism, how politics and other ideologies becoming our identities can mess with our ability to think clearly and work collaboratively with each other, and other things that can flatten the way that we think and our perception of the world and other people in such a way that it makes it difficult for us to function as a healthy, evolving, growing society. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of What's Our Problem by Tim Urban. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.